and welcome back to the Great Amazing Book Show. I have my snowboard stuff in the back of the car. We went skiing and snowboarding yesterday, my wife and I, and we had a great time. But our book today, before we start, does anyone know anyone who is selfish? Do you know what the word selfish means? A selfish person only cares about themselves and they only care about their things and they don't like to share. Oftentimes we can tell that someone else is selfish. We ourselves are never selfish. No, I would never be selfish. It's actually something that's hard to see in yourself. As we read today's story, think about selfishness and think of maybe ways that you could try not to be selfish. We have a story about a little boy. His name is Dick Thompson, and he is selfish. He only cares about himself and his things. He's very concerned about people not touching his things, not playing with his toys, not taking his food, and that's a problem. So, without further ado, we will dig into the story of Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle and how she is going to deal with this problem. Dick Thompson was certainly a nice-looking boy, and he was smart in school and behaved well at the table. But whenever his name was mentioned, people said, "Poor, poor Mrs. Thompson. She has such a problem. Whatever will she do with that child?" I guess that you would feel simply dreadful if people said a thing like that when your name was mentioned, but Dick didn't. You see, Dick Thompson was a selfish, greedy boy, and he cared more about being a selfish, greedy boy than about what people said. When children came over to his house to play, Dick said, "Don't touch that. That's mine. You can't play with that. That's mine. Put down my ball. Take off my skates." Each time this happened, at least each time it happened where his mother would hear Dick saying, "That's mine," she would send him up to his room to think about how selfish he was. Dick would go right upstairs, for he was very obedient, but instead of thinking how bad it was to be selfish, he would sit on the bed and swing his legs and think, "Everything in this room is mine, and nobody is going to touch my things." He certainly was a problem. One day, Dick's mother bought a big box of peppermint sticks. She called Dick into the house and said, "Now, dear, I have bought this large box of peppermint sticks for you, but I want you to share them with your friends. There are about 50 sticks in the box, and I want you to divide them with all the children in the neighborhood. Don't forget the little children. And you might send one or two to old Mrs. Burry. She is so fond of peppermint." Dick said, "Thank you, Mother, for the fine candy." Then he took the box out of doors and put it in the basket on the front of his bicycle and allowed the neighborhood children to look at the peppermint sticks. But he warned them, "This is my candy, and if anyone touches it, I will hit him with my baseball bat." What a naughty kid. The children in his neighborhood had known Dick for some time, and they knew that he meant what he said. But as they looked at the candy, they wished and wished they could have just one stick. Dick's mother, watching from the window, saw all the children gathered around Dick and the box of candy in the basket on the front of his bicycle, and she thought to herself, "Just look at my little son dividing the candy with all of his little friends. I just knew he would learn to be generous." And she tapped on the window, and when Dick looked around, she waved and smiled at him. She's so proud. Dick waved and smiled back. Ha! But unfortunately, just then, Mary O'Toole, who was quite daring, reached in and grabbed a stick of the candy, and crack! Dick clouted her on the hand with the baseball bat. Ow! In a flash, his mother saw what was really going on. She flew out the front door, took Dick firmly by the arm, and marched him upstairs, thrust him into his room, and slammed the door. Then she went downstairs and out the front door, took the box of candy, and told Mary O'Toole to divide it up among all the children, even the little ones, and to take 1 or 2 sticks over to old Mrs. Bury, because she was so fond of peppermint. There were 15 children, not counting Dick, and 50 sticks of candy, so each child was given 3 sticks, and old Mrs. Bury got 5. From the window of his bedroom, Dick watched Mary divide the candy, and he was just furious. After all the candy had been divided, Mrs. Thompson went into the house and called Dick's father. She said, "Herbert, I know that you are busy and you don't like to have me call you at the office, but I'm so worried about Dick." Dick's father said, "What is the matter? Is he sick?" Dick's mother said, "No, but I just wish he were. It would be so much simpler." Mr. Thompson said, "Now, dear, I am very busy, so perhaps you had better wait until I come home." Mrs. Thompson said, "Herbert, this cannot wait another minute." And she told him about the candy and the baseball bat. Mr. Thompson said, "Why not give him a good hard spanking? Tell him that you are going to give him something that he can keep all to himself. Ha ha! Now, Herbert, this is not a laughing matter, and I don't think a spanking will solve a thing. I just don't know what to do or which way to turn." And Mrs. Thompson began to cry, partly because she felt so humiliated over Dick's selfishness, and partly because she knew the crying was one way to get action out of Dick's father. Dick's father said, Now, dear, tears won't help. Let me see. Shall I hop into a taxi and come home and thrash Dick?" Dick's mother only cried louder. Dick's father said, I know just what to do. Call that Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, Mrs. Wriggle-Spiggle, or whatever her name is. You know, the one who cured Hubert Prentice." "You mean Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle? Oh, Herbert, you are so wonderful. I knew you would think of something. I'll call her right away." And Mrs. Thompson blew her nose. She probably honked into a big Kleenex. "I'll call her right away." And she cheered right up. Mothers always do cheer up when they think of Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle because she knows so much about children. After all, she has had about 1,000 little boys and girls come to her house to pull taffy, play checkers, bake cookies, drink cambric tea, and dig for the pirate gold buried in the backyard. So she has had plenty of opportunity to learn about childish ailments and the cures for them. She was certainly the person to ask about Dick, the selfish boy, and so Mrs. Thompson telephoned her. She said, "Hello, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle? This is Mrs. Thompson, Dick's mother." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. I have rather expected you to call." With all the other kids, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle has something nice to say, but she doesn't have anything nice to say about Dick. Mrs. Thompson said, "You have? Why?" "Because I know Dick very well," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, "and although he is a dear little boy and the most well-mannered child who comes to visit me," I guess he does have some nice things to have said about him, "never once forgetting to say thank you and please, he is very selfish." "Oh, I know he is, said Mrs. Thompson, almost crying because she was so ashamed that Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle should know how selfish Dick was. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Now, Mrs. Thompson, do not feel sad. Selfishness and greediness are just diseases like measles and chickenpox and can be cured very easily, but we must start now, before another day passes, because Dick is such a nice little boy, and we want everyone to like him as we do." Do you ever think that about people who are selfish? That they're actually pretty nice people if they could just learn to handle that one thing. Or maybe it's you. Maybe you're the selfish one, and you're a really good kid, but if you're selfish, it makes it hard for people to like you because you don't share anything. Let's see what happens. "Oh, do you like him in spite of his selfishness?" asked Dick's mother. "Of course I do," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. "I love all children, but it distresses me when I see a child who has a disease like selfishness or answer-backism or won't put away toys-itis, and his parents don't do a thing to cure him." "But I want to cure Dick," said his mother. "I will do anything to cure him." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "The selfishness cure is really very simple, but the rules must be followed very strictly or it won't work. You will have to come down here and get my selfishness kit, and at the same time I will give you the directions for its use." "Thank you so much, dear Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle," said Mrs. Thompson. "I will leave right now," and she hung up the phone. She slipped on a jacket and ran all the way to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's house. You can tell it's Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's house because it's upside down. All the other houses on the street are right side up. When she arrived, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle was on the front porch waiting for her. On the porch beside her was quite a large green metal box with "Selfishness Kit" painted on its side in white letters. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle invited Dick's mother to sit down, and then she opened the kit. Inside were about 25 padlocks of various sizes. There were great big ones about the size of apples. Do you know what a padlock is? I don't have a padlock here in the car, but a padlock is it has a loop of metal and then a big blocky part of metal, and you put a key in the bottom of it and to unlock it, and you can use it on like a door or a hinge or something that has a little latch that flips over and there's a hole there, and you put the little part through and you lock it, and then nobody can have the thing. Why would the selfishness kit be filled with all of those? It says there were great big ones the size of apples, down to little tiny ones not much larger than a penny. Also, there were screws and a screwdriver, a box of cloth labels that said Dick, a box of blank gummed labels. Blank gummed labels must be like stickers. A small can of white paint, a small can of black paint, a small paintbrush, and a pastry bag. This is a large bag with a nozzle on the end, which when filled with frosting can be squeezed, and the frosting comes out the end like toothpaste and can be formed into words. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Mrs. Thompson, these padlocks are for Dick's drawers, his closets, his toy chest, his bicycle, his bedroom door, his nightstand drawer, and his toothbrush. As soon as you get home, put the padlocks on everything he owns and give the keys to him. This is to assure him that he and he alone can touch his things. The name labels are to be sewn in all of his clothes, and the gummed stickers are to be put in all of his books, even his school books, notebooks, pencil boxes, and are to be pasted on his ruler, crayons, and paints. On each sticker, print in large letters with this black paint, Dick's book, don't touch." Big exclamation mark, because an exclamation mark means it's yelling almost. "Dick's notebook, don't touch," and so forth. On every toy he owns, you must paint in either black or white paint. "Dick's ball, don't touch," or "Dick's bat, don't touch." Put the name of the toy first and then "don't touch" in big letters and exclamation points. The pastry bag is to be filled with a simple white frosting and used to mark Dick's sandwiches, his fruit, his cookies, and his plate for each meal. That's all there is to it. I expect you will be returning the selfishness kit before a week has passed. Mrs. Thompson said, "I do hope so, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. Are you sure it will work? It has cured hundreds of other children, and I see no reason why it should not cure Dick. A week, or even less, I should say." Mrs. Thompson thanked Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle very much, and then lugging the kit, she walked home. As soon as she had hung up her jacket, she began sewing the labels in all of Dick's clothes. He asked her what she was doing, and when she showed him, he was as happy as he could be. He asked her what she was doing, and when she showed him, he was as happy as could be. "Boy, that will just show people who owns my clothes," he said proudly. Mrs. Thompson did not answer, but continued to put the labels on every single stitch of his clothing, including his socks and his handkerchiefs. Then she opened the kit and took out the tiniest padlock. She fastened Dick's toothbrush to the toothbrush rack with the little padlock, snapped it shut, and handed the key, which was not much bigger than a pin, to Dick. "You had better find a ring to hold your keys," she said. "You're going to have about 25 of them." "Boy, that's just wonderful," Dick said, fondling the tiny key and thinking, "That's my toothbrush, and now nobody but me can touch it." He was very happy. What a weird little boy. When dinner time came, Mrs. Thompson closed the selfishness kit. I say weird because you probably aren't that selfish, are you? Would you feel really happy if you could lock up everything you own? Because if you would, maybe you're weird too, like he is, and you really have a selfishness problem. No, none of us have a selfishness problem. Just the kid in the book. When dinner time came, Mrs. Thompson closed the selfishness kit and took it downstairs to show Dick's father. She told him about Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, and he patted her on the back and said that he was sure everything was going to be all right. And where was the evening paper? After dinner, they went upstairs to put some of the padlocks on and were surprised to find that Dick himself had already put the locks on each of his bureau drawers. His nightstand drawer, his toy box, his closet door, and his bedroom door. He had also put stickers on the covers of all of his books, notebooks, coloring books, crayon and colored pencil boxes, and stamp album. On the stickers, he had printed in black letters, "Dick's book, don't touch." "Dick's notebook, don't touch." "Dick's crayons, don't touch." "Dick's pencil box, don't touch." "Dick's stamp album, do not touch." He was very proud and asked his father if he didn't think he printed well. His father said, "You should be able to print well. You have certainly practiced enough." And he looked disgustedly around the room at the stickers which labeled everything. "Dick's brush, don't touch." "Dick's comb, don't touch." "Dick's window blind, don't touch." He turned to Dick's mother and said, "Perhaps we should wear stickers." "Dick's mother, don't touch." "Dick's father, don't touch." "I'll bet he'll wear monogrammed underwear when he grows up." Monogrammed means his name is stitched into the lining of his underwear. Mrs. Thompson said, "Oh, I hope not, Herbert." Dick said, "Come on, Mom and Dad, let's mark all the rest of my stuff." He's having such a good time. And so they worked until 8:30, marking Dick's bicycle, his baseball, his bat, his pitcher's glove, his catcher's glove, his toolbox, his roller skates, his lunchbox, his rubber boots, his raincoat, his Indian suit, his soldier suit, his gun, and his wagon. They even painted "Dick's dog, don't touch" on Rover's collar. They didn't put Rover's name, they put Dick's dog. It matters more that he belongs to Dick than that his name is Rover. Isn't that terrible, what selfishness can do? When they had finished and it was time for Dick to go to bed, he kissed his mother and said goodnight to his father and went happily up the stairs, his ring of keys jingling from his belt, like he's a repairman or something. He's got a ton of keys hanging off of his waistband. Mr. Thompson sank down into a chair in the living room and lit his pipe. A lot of people smoked pipes back then. I don't think they do that anymore. It's kind of bad for you. "I trust that Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle knows what she is doing," he said, "because if this cure should not work, our son Dick is going to be the most loathsome boy in the whole world." I love that word. That's an old one. Loathsome. He's so loathsome. Because if he's loathsome, everyone loathes him. Loathing is like hating. They loathe him. Mrs. Thompson said, "Oh, no, dear, not in the whole world." The next morning, they heard Dick clicking and snapping at his padlocks long before they were up. He was a little late coming downstairs because it took time to padlock all of his drawers, his closet door, and the door of his room. Nobody goes in there when he's at school. Why is he's so worried about people touching his stuff? He thinks his mom's going to go in his room and play with his toys while he's gone. Isn't that ridiculous? Moms don't play with toys. He was a little late coming downstairs because it took time to padlock all of his drawers, his closet door, and the door of his room. But he was very happy, and his mother noticed that he had pinned one of the name labels on the outside of his sweater. While he was eating his breakfast, marked "Dick's breakfast, don't touch," his mother marked his sandwiches. "Dick's sandwiches." She has that toothpaste tube thing. It's not toothpaste, it's just frosting. He gets frosting on everything he eats. It's probably going to give him cavities. Dick's sandwiches, don't touch, and his apple. Dick's apple, don't touch, and his cookies. Dick's cookies, do not touch. His lunchbox, and had already been marked. Dick's lunchbox, don't touch. After breakfast, Dick put the lunchbox in the basket on his bicycle and noticed proudly the large sign hanging from the crossbar. Guess what it says? Dick's bicycle, don't touch! At school, the children paid little attention to the sign on his bicycle, but when he opened his lunchbox and took out the sandwiches marked, Dick's sandwiches, don't touch! And the apple marked, Dick's apple, don't touch! And the cookies marked, Dick's cookies, don't touch! Everyone laughed and wanted to see them, and in the resulting crowding and pushing, one of the sandwiches was dropped and stepped on, and some of the big boys grabbed the apple and tossed it in the air just above Dick's head, shouting, "Throw me Dick's apple! Oh, look, I dropped Dick's apple! I wonder if Dick's apple will bounce!" When they finally gave Dick his apple, it was bruised and very dirty. In arithmetic period that afternoon, Bobby Slater across the aisle asked Dick for his ruler, and when he saw the label, Dick's ruler, don't touch, he began to laugh and reached over and snatched the ruler off Dick's desk and passed it to Kenny Hatch, who laughed and passed it to the girl in front of him. And finally, Miss Crabtree had to come down and get it. When she saw the sign, she laughed too, but she gave the ruler back to Dick. After school, the boys decided to play baseball in the vacant lot by Dick's house. But when Dick brought out his baseball bat and ball and mitts, and the boys saw, Dick's ball, don't touch! Dick's bat, don't touch! They said, we can't touch anything, so let's go home. And they did. Dick went up to his room to play, but he found that somewhere during the day he had lost the key to his closet, and that he had locked the key to his toy chest in the chest. So he went down and sat on the front porch and listened to the shouts of the children playing in Hubert Prentice's yard. The next morning at school, during recess, nobody would play with him, and the little girls followed him and laughed. When they marched into school, the children pointed and laughed, and Miss Crabtree came down to see what the trouble was, and she almost laughed herself when she saw the sign someone had pinned on the back of Dick's sweater. It said, "This is Dick, don't touch." At lunchtime, the children crowded around to watch him take out his sandwiches, and one little girl said, "He's so selfish and greedy. He has his sandwiches marked so he can't share them." Then the children danced around him and chanted, "Dick's sandwich, don't touch. Dick's apple, don't touch. Dick's lunchbox, don't touch." Finally, Dick took his lunchbox out and put it in the basket on his bicycle, but the children followed him, and seeing the big sign, "Dick's bicycle, don't touch," they yelled and laughed and sang, "Dick's don't touch Dick. Dick's don't touch Dick." After school, Dick hurried right home, but he had lost the key to his room, so he went down to the basement to play with his toolbox. But every time he saw the large white sign, "Dick's toolbox, don't touch," he thought of school and the lunchbox, and he remembered how the children laughed and jeered, and he was ashamed. At dinner, when his mother brought him his plate marked "Dick's dinner, don't touch," he said, "Why do you have to mark my plate? I don't care which one I get." Mrs. Thompson looked significantly at Mr. Thompson and said, "All right, Dick, we won't mark your plate if you will share your dessert with Rover." Dick thought for a few minutes, and then he carefully broke his chocolate cake into 2 equal pieces and gave one to Rover, who gulped it down and looked grateful and had to go to the vet because he died right after. Back then, I guess you could give chocolate to dogs. You can't give chocolate to dogs now. Don't do it. It'll make your dog so sick. It doesn't say that Rover got sick. I think that the woman who wrote this book didn't have a dog and didn't know you don't give chocolate cake to dogs. So she put in there that you put chocolate, you give it, she thinks dogs eat chocolate cake. They don't. After dinner, Dick told his father he had lost the keys to his room in the closet, and so his father took off the padlocks on those doors and on the toy box. How does father take the padlocks off if Dick lost the keys? Oh, bolt cutters. A padlock is very strong, and somebody can't tear it with their hands or cut it with scissors, but there is a tool called bolt cutters that if you use that, it has a big ratchety thing like when you prune a tree, it looks like one of those, and you can cut through the metal of a lock. His dad must have one of those down in the basement. Don't put them back, Dad. I don't care who goes into my room or gets into my stuff. The next morning, Dick got up early and scraped the Dick's lunchbox, don't touch, from his lunchbox and took the sign off his bicycle. Then he went in to his mother and said, Mom, please don't mark my sandwiches. Please don't mark any of my stuff, Mom. Mrs. Thompson said, all right, Dick. I only did it to protect you. Dick said, I don't care who gets my lunch. Just don't mark it. At noon, all the children gathered around Dick, but neither his sandwiches, nor his apple, nor his lunchbox were marked, so they rushed out to see his bicycle. But there was no sign on it. So they sat down and ate their lunches. Right after school that night, Dick hurried home and scraped the marking off his ball and bat and mitts. And then he walked up to where the children were playing ball and tossing the ball, bat, and mitts down beside the catcher. He said, do you want to use these? I don't care. And he went back to his own house. That's a little different. In a little while, Mary O'Toole rang the doorbell and asked Mrs. Thompson if Dick could come out and play. Mrs. Thompson said, he'd love to, Mary, but first he must return something to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. Mary said, tell him to come over to the lot when he gets back, and here are some keys he lost. Mrs. Thompson said, thank you for the keys, dear, but thank goodness they belong to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, not to Dick. She took the keys of the big padlocks and the tiny padlock up to Dick, who was in his room, busily packing Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's Selfishness kit. Whew. All that laughter and all that getting made fun of made Dick realize that being selfish is not a fun way to live your life. It's a lot better when you can share things with people and not worry that they're going to use something that's yours or touch something that's yours. Well, that reminds me of a story I should tell you about when I was a little boy, and I grew up with a bunch of brothers, and my mom had a terrible time with us being selfish at dinner time. There were 5 of us boys. I have to always think of it because I have 4 brothers and I have 1 sister. There's 6 kids in my family, and I was the second oldest. And at dinner time, we sat around a big table, and my dad would sit at the one end, and my mom always wanted to sit next to my dad. And so that means there was a seat at the end where you didn't have to sit by anybody. The worst place to sit at the table was in the middle on either side, because then you have somebody right on both sides elbowing you whenever they reach for something or they put out their arm. And so you hated to sit in the middle. The next best place to sit was right on the corner of each bench. But if you got to sit on the end, you got to sit in a regular chair instead of on a bench. And that meant you could lean back and you didn't have anybody bumping elbows. So everybody wanted to sit there. And we were very, very selfish about getting to sit at the end of the table. And I don't know who came up with it, if it was my older brother or my younger brother, just younger than me. But of the 3 of us, and it probably could have been me, we decided that the best way to mark it was, instead of using an icing tube with frosting and putting our name on the plate, that the best way to mark the plate so no one else would want to sit at the end was licking. And I remember one time, this only happened once. I think we got in big trouble for it, and my mom did not let us do that ever again. I think all 3 of us had to go to our rooms. But someone grabbed the plate. You would try to sit in the chair. If you could sit in the chair, then it was your spot, except that if you could lick the plate, then the person in the chair wouldn't want to sit there anymore. And so one brother grabs the plate. "Ah, it's my plate." And the brother in the chair got a bright idea. "I'm gonna lick the table." And he licked the table. Both of them are fighting over the spot. I must not have been involved in this one. I think it was my younger brother and my older brother. But they were in a lick this, like one grabs a fork and licks, and the other grabbed the spoon and licked. They tore apart this place setting, licking whatever they could until one is licking the table. Oh my goodness, it was so terrible. And Mom never let anybody lick the table again to mark their spot, because that's a terrible habit and a terrible. Can you imagine if people went around doing that? If you went into the lunchroom at school and you licked the table where you wanted to sit so that no one would sit in your spot? Oh, that's terrible. Just terrible, but very funny. We were very selfish kids. I think all kids have a little bit of selfishness in them, and it's best if you can learn to try to share. Because it's hard to share, but if you share, you can make friends with people, and you can make friends of your little brothers and sisters. I think that's the hardest part, is having to share with younger brothers and sisters. Older brothers and sisters who share, you never really think about it. But maybe we should be more grateful that older brothers and sisters share things, because they got cool stuff. Anyway, that's our story. This is Piggle-Wiggle. Next time we read, hold on, a little preview. We are going to be on the chapter, The Radish Cure. Does anyone know what a radish is? A radish is a small red, looks like a berry, but it is not a berry. It's a vegetable. And it's very bitter, and not a lot of people like them. Maybe you've never had one. I don't eat them very often. Sometimes I do. I learned to make pickled ones, and those I actually liked quite a bit. But yeah, when I was little, I did not like radishes. And I guess this chapter is all about a girl who refuses to eat her radishes, unless it's some kind of metaphor. A metaphor means we call it one thing, but we mean another thing, like feeding your dog chocolate cake is a bad idea. So if you're doing something stupid, we say that's feeding your dog chocolate cake. That's a metaphor. So maybe the radish cure has to do with something else, but I think it has to do with a little girl who refuses to eat her vegetables. And that's what we're going to read tomorrow. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, thanks for watching.